this is your host, Julia Napini. I am a clinical and forensic social worker who owns a counseling practice and a consulting business. In this show, we discuss the challenges of being successful in business while maintaining your integrity and staying true to yourself. Join me while I interview other professionals and share insights from life and experience. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Compassionate Climb podcast. We are here, it's been a while, for another Ask the Expert segment. We have Alesia Galati with us today to talk all things podcasting. So stay tuned. For those of you that are maybe in the early stages of your podcasting journey, considering starting one, if it's always been a dream of yours or something that you feel intimidated by, we're going to try to decrease that overwhelm and make it happen and ensure that it's successful. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia. I'm very excited. Obviously, I love talking about podcasting, so I'm excited.
Oh, so am I. So I had the pleasure of being on your show, and I had so much fun. I found your energy to be infectious. Your enthusiasm for what you do came across, and it was just a no-brainer to have you on here. So share with the audience your podcasting journey and anything else that is relevant to where you're at in your life and what you do.
Yeah, so I started listening to podcasts back in 2015. And at that point, I was a newer mom. I had a 1-year-old, and I had to drive my son to his babysitter because my mother-in-law could no longer watch him. Drive him to the babysitter, then drive to work, which my work was 5 minutes from my house, and I had to go 40 minutes out of the way both ways to drive him to this sitter. So I was like, man, they keep playing the same 5 songs on the radio. This is so annoying. And that is how I discovered podcasts, because I was listening on what was Google Play, which is now Google Podcasts. Back in the day, for the OG listeners.
I was literally going to say you're a podcasting OG.
Yeah, and the first podcast I listened to was Stuff You Should Know, which is a huge podcast now. I believe like NPR owns it or whatever. Anyway, I loved this idea of being able to, I'm a lifelong learner. I was getting my associates at the time, then went on to get my bachelor's, and like I just love learning. So to be able to drive and not mindlessly listen to the same 5 songs, but to be able to learn something exciting and something new, and I would get to work and I'd be like, guys, I just learned the craziest thing on my commute. And I worked with a bunch of men because I worked in manufacturing. They were just like, whatever, Alesia. But I was so excited about this. Ended up finding some other kind of mom entrepreneur podcasts, started listening to those. I was like, wait, you're telling me that I can like have a side job and make money and not have to worry about like, not that I want to be home with my kids all day. That's not really my thing, but to be able to have more expansion in my income and the availability of money to me. And I really liked that idea.
Yeah.
So I decided to kind of dabble into the online space from there. Didn't think that a podcast would be in my wheelhouse whatsoever. There was a lot of, and this is something that I talk to my clients about a lot, is a lot of imposter syndrome around who am I to stand in front of a mic, which I'm doing now, which is weird, but who am I to do this or to share my knowledge with anyone? And when I was 18, I got really, really sick, and it completely changed my voice. So I went from, singing soprano to singing alto, and like I just have this more tenor, deep voice now. And even like working with guys are jerks and relentless sometimes. And I had this coworker who said, that was a blanket statement, not all guys are jerks. I know this, but I had a coworker who was a jerk, and he said that, oh, Alesia, you have one of those voices that just makes me want to punch you in the face. And I was like, whoa, first of all, you're rude. But it like fed that internal voice that I was already telling myself that like, who am I to have these conversations? Who am I for people to listen to me? I probably have an annoying voice if this random dude who I've known for years says I have an annoying voice. Fast forward to 2018. I said, you know what? I'm going to do the thing. And at the time, I was doing more supply chain in manufacturing and saw that there wasn't a lot of information in the online space specifically for product-based businesses. A lot of the information was based towards service providers or coaches or consultants. And so I decided to launch a podcast that was specifically e-commerce. So it's called The Honest Product Bench. You can still listen to it. Please don't, but you could. The Honest Product Bench. And I talked marketing strategies. I talked understanding your inventory levels. But I was doing that stuff in my day job, and I did not want to talk about it outside of my day job if I didn't have to. So I had since pod faded that. Fast forward again to 2019, my mom passed away, and I was dealing with a lot of feelings around my childhood. I grew up in a cult that she had brought us to. We were there for 10 years, and I wanted to process it. Like, I couldn't ask her the questions that I wanted to know. I didn't understand the reasons why she might have done that. And so I asked my sister, I said, hey, do you want to launch a podcast about cults? And she was like, yes. And so in early 2020, we launched Two Sisters and a Cult. And we ran that for about a year and a half. Got to the point where it was really depressing talking about cults. And we had kind of already hashed out emotionally everything that we wanted to kind of process for ourselves. And so we stopped that one. At that point, when around the time that we stopped it, that was the beginning of COVID. And so I had done launched these two podcasts, had a ton of success with the second one, realized, you know, I could probably do this for other people. I mean, I know what I'm doing. I know how to edit it. I know how to market it. I have a degree in marketing too. Like, I've got all this experience. Let me test it out and see. I'm the sole financial provider for my family. My husband is a stay-at-home dad and homeschools our kids. So making money, really important. And it knew it wasn't going to be just a hobby thing. Like, if I'm going in, I'm going in. I'm going to have a team. This is how I want to build it. And so I did. Launched a couple of podcasts at this point. So that was the, March 2020 when all that happened. Now we're in 2023 and we have launched over 20 podcasts. We have done 1,500 episodes. It is insane. But yeah, that's kind of my podcasting journey.
Wow. Let me take a moment and process all of that. That's a lot, but what an incredible journey it was. So you had benefited from podcasts yourself. It helped to pass the time and engage that lifelong learner in you for those drives. Then you decided to give it a whirl and you immersed yourself. It was kind of an extension of what you were already doing in your day job. And then you almost turned to it as a way to delve deeper and explore and get some questions answered for something in your own life, which is really intriguing to me. And then took it all the way to helping so many people get over that hump, do it, be successful at it, and it's totally taken off. So I'm assuming the place you're at right now is not what you anticipated when you began the journey. Is that accurate?
Not at all. No, not even remotely. I mean, sometimes I talk to my clients and I'll be like, oh, this, and a lot of the ideas that I have tend to be off the cuff, very like fast thinking kind of thing. And I have my team on some of those calls. They're like, how did you come up with that? And I'm like, I don't know. It just happens. So like, I fell into it, and the way that I grew this business was so focused on values and the values that I hold dear. So making money for my family, allowing my team to make decent money for their families, being able to amplify the voices of people and make an actual impact in the world. And we're doing that. And I think as long as I like stayed true to like those values, I'm along for the ride. It's going to be great.
So you know from our previous discussion that I am very value driven myself, and I have so much respect but also appreciation for people that really do the work and take the time to get clear on those. They can say it loud and proud, and then not only uphold that themselves and make decisions that are in line with it, but you also transfer that to your team. So how big is your team at this point?
At this point, we recently, one has gone on maternity leave, so she is gone, but we're down to 2 because business is slow this year. It is very strange, but we're hanging in there. We're doing all right. And looking at different ways to diversify what we're doing. So a lot of our services are very high touch, which means they cost more money, which means it's not accessible to the everyday podcaster. So looking at ways where I can do what I like to do, which is sitting in front of a microphone and talking to people within reason. I'm an introvert, so like within reason, right? But like workshops. So offering some mini courses, really focusing on those lead magnets and not making them as crazy big, because it's like, I'm just going to give you everything I can because I can't really help you right now in the way that I want. So making those very strategic, creating content for them. So we're doing some shifting and keeping the team lean, but I do try to keep them at close to full-time hours.
Fantastic. So with this journey that you've been on, what are some of the biggest lessons learned and tips that you have for those people that are listening and have considered a podcast or are early on and might be getting a little discouraged? Clearly, your message is, if you have a voice and you have something to say, do it. And don't allow anything to hold you back. And you're seeing the impact of that, and you're helping people to have more of an impact. But what are the tips and the biggest things you've learned?
Yeah, so as much as I'm like, hoorah, do the thing, I also don't want people to rush into it. And I think that is like one of the main tips that I can like impart. That's the only thing you listen to, is be strategic, right? When you launch your podcast, because 90% of podcasts don't make it past 20 episodes. So if you want to be part of that 10% that does make it past that amount, then you have to really be clear on, like you said, your values. Be clear on what it is that you want your podcast to accomplish. If it's to create a deeper connection with a friend, or like how my sister and I were doing, we needed to process some things. And so we were doing that in a vocal way where we were able to connect with other people who were raising their hand and saying, oh my goodness, me too, which was wild, right? And so like you can do it that way. Or if your goal is to grow your business, all right, then you got to be really strategic. But there are tons of courses out there. They're like, launch your podcast in 30 days or launch your podcast in 2 weeks. I actually recommend 2 months. And so taking that time to really at the beginning figure out not only how can you make sure that you're accomplishing your goals, but also make sure that what you're saying is true to you and is needed. So we had one client where they were looking to launch a podcast. And when we did the market research, we found that there weren't a lot of podcasts on this topic. And the topic was GMOs. There were a lot of episodes on it, but not a lot of like full podcasts on the topic, which means there's not enough to say about it. So this should be more of a limited series, which we're seeing a lot more podcasters do. So if you feel like, look, I don't know if I can show up for the next 3 years for a podcast, that feels like a lot, then consider a limited series. Say, all right, I'm going to show up for 12 episodes. I've got them mapped out. They're cornerstone type of content. I think I can do that. Cool. And then at the end of 12, you decide, I kind of want to do another 12. Make that season 2, right? Like there's so much room and flexibility to have fun with it, but still be super strategic with it. So I would say those are like the top 2 ones, is like, make sure you're clear on your goals and be strategic when you do decide to launch.
Definitely appreciate you saying that, because we all have different personality types, and I can see there being some that are, I've set my mind to something, I'm doing it, that's it. There are other people that might think it to death. So it sounds like with everything, it's about balance. And there are definitely some key things you should be thinking about and planning for. And I love that you gave a time frame. It is very reasonable and tangible, and that's not extensive, but within that time, what would you say are key things that people should be doing? So getting clear on their values, getting clear on, I'm assuming, who their audience is, the purpose of the podcast. What about the actual logistical side of things in those 2 months? So I'm sure that they can hire somebody like you guys and you take care of a lot of that stuff. If somebody did want to launch on their own, what would that look like versus maybe the cost and process of having somebody take care of it for you when you're not necessarily monetizing the podcast right out the gate?
Yeah. So over the course of the 2 months, kind of how I kind of break it down is that first 2 weeks is going to be your market research and you're getting clear on those goals. So that's those first 2 weeks. Now the market research, that is one of our main selling points because a lot of podcasters do not do this part, and it is important too. And during that market research, we are looking at what are the competitors doing? What are they talking about? Are they still producing podcasts? Are they potential collaborators that you can connect with? What are the topics that seem to be really popular that they keep talking about over and over again? How can you take your own spin on those topics to make them relevant to your voice and what you think and how you feel about that topic? So those are those first 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks is recording your trailer, your intro, your outro, kind of getting those nitty gritty details, your graphics, the fun parts. The fun ones. Like, we just launched a podcast, or it's going to launch next week, and it's called Fired Up, and it's a marketing agency, and I love it because I geeked out to my team. They were like, okay, Alesia, whatever. But at the beginning, it's like a match getting out of a box and getting lit, and then there's like a fire whoosh and then a dousing extinguisher at the end. So like fun stuff, right? All of these different things you can do with your show. That's the fun part. And then from there, so that's a month window. That next month is almost exclusively recording those next episodes, those 3 or 4 episodes that you're going to launch with, and marketing it. This is another thing that I see a lot of people do wrong, is that they're like, ooh, something's coming. Your audience is not kids. You don't need to tease it like that. They're gonna lose interest so fast. So you gotta let them know what's coming.
Yeah.
Get them involved. One way that we've seen people do that is, we had one client where she wrote a post and said, hey, if I were to launch a podcast, what are some topics that you think I would talk about? Great. She can go back to that post and say, hey, I decided to launch this podcast and I picked your topic because I think it definitely aligns with what I like to talk about. Would you like the episode link? There's another way to connect with your audience. We had another person, she had already picked her cover art, but she was like, here are 4 potential cover arts that I'm working on for my podcast. Which one do you like? She already knew which one she was going to get, but it ends up engaging the audience, right? So things like that. And this is taking some marketing that I've seen from like book launches, because I'm very big in the Bookstagram community. And so like the ways that book people or authors release their books is so applicable to the way that we can release podcasts. Yeah. And one of those is like when they're teasing characters, right? And it's like, okay, how can you relate that to podcasts? So I have this really incredible guest. Maybe I can try to see if my audience can guess who this guest is based on these 3 things about the guest. Maybe they know who this is, right? And so it creates that excitement and that like anticipation, and being super clear, there's a podcast coming, right? So that way they're not like, what's happening? So that, and another secret tip that I don't see any podcasters do either. And that is, you most likely have to release your trailer about 2 weeks before your podcast goes live. That is so that all of the platforms can have your podcast ready and available on your launch day. So your trailer goes live then. And so you're going to create what I like to call your street team. That's also another author thing. Your street team. These are your ride or dies. These are the biz besties, people who are going to be so excited and are not going to leave critical reviews. Like, these are the people that you want to send that trailer to be able to leave those reviews early, to send those graphics to, that when you launch, they can also share it. So then it almost is like a snowball effect, right? So you're not just like, hey, it's out in the world, crickets. This is really depressing, right? Like, you don't want that. You want people to be excited. And so that was like one of the main ways that we were able to, when we launched our cult podcast, was through this. And we actually took 3 months to promote it because we were starting our audience from zero. And we literally shared memes for 3 months straight about cults to grow that audience and get people excited about the podcast. And we had people DMing us, when is this podcast coming out? Please tell me, I need to know. So like that is how you get people excited.
Mm-hmm. Pure brilliance there. So the first thing that I think is so important to reiterate, so you're almost dividing it up into 3 categories at the outset. Before you even launch, it's you do your research to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success and that this is something that is going to ultimately have an audience. Something that's already out there, you put your spin on it, that you're not reinventing the wheel, so to speak, or coming up with something so obsolete that not enough people are going to be interested or engaged in. Mm-hmm. And then you're doing the logistical fun stuff, which I think so many people can jump on right away. But then you're also really spending time, concentrated effort on the marketing piece and building up that anticipation. And those were such great tips for how to do that in a way that really engages the audience, makes them feel, or your prospective audience, makes them feel like they're a part of it. It's okay to start off with your core people that are going to support you unequivocally. But then obviously as time goes on, you want that to build into new people who have their own feedback. And then you're going to have your core group no matter what. So that's so important. I don't think many people, unless they have that guidance, are really laying it out like that when you start. And then once you get going, so you obviously had a lot of success. It's almost like you compared the 2 podcasts and you're like, don't listen to the first one. The second one sounded like it was really successful. So you have that contrast. You've also helped people to have successful podcasts themselves. What constitutes podcast success? And what are more things that people can do throughout that are going to increase the likelihood that that is them?
Oh, I love this question so much because this is one of my, it depends, which I say so much. My friends, I probably drive them crazy with the amount of times I'm like, well, it depends. See, there are the options, right? And so this is something that definitely depends because comparing those 2 podcasts is like comparing apples to oranges. They're 2 completely different topics. The audience for the e-commerce one is so much smaller than people who are interested in true crime and cults. And so considering that, like when I look at what I could have done differently for that first one of the clearest things that I can see hindsight is having clear goals. That is what determines your podcast success. So if you are achieving those goals, we have clients where one client just hit 100,000 downloads and we were like, hoorah, that is incredible. And she was like, oh, well, I have this other friend who also talks about some similar topics and she just hit 1 million. And I was like, pause, time out. Time out. First of all, 100,000 downloads is incredible. Most people are not going to get that high at all. Also, you are talking to a very specific person. She is talking to a broader group of those people. So your people are in her audience, but her audience is not your audience. And so what are your goals? Are your goals to get clients from your podcast? Yes. Have you done that? Yes. Then it's a success. Mm-hmm. Have you been able to have your, hers is very much around creating boundaries and being very assertive with your boundaries and holding those boundaries with the people that you love and care about or the people who drive you crazy, all that kind of stuff. And so have people reached out and said, this has changed my life. Yes. Then it is a success, right? So when you go back to those goals and you are meeting those goals and achieving those goals, and those goals can shift, right? I don't recommend changing them every month, but they can shift. But if you're meeting those, then you're successful. Mm-hmm. But to put a number on it, because I know there are people in the audience who are like, well, I need a number. I did an episode that was on podcast milestones that you should be celebrating. Ooh. 25 episodes. 50 episodes, 100 episodes, and so on. Those are impressive milestones, and those are worth celebrating. And they're also great ways to reignite your audience with excitement. So we had one client hit 100 episodes. We said, all right, we're getting close. We're about 5 weeks away. I want you to reach back out to all of the people that you've had on your show as a guest. It was maybe 20. She doesn't do a lot of guests. Anybody she'd had on her show, and ask them if they'd be part of your 100 episode celebration. Great. They were willing to do that. And so then she was able to get it promoted as like, I hit 100 episodes. This is so incredible. And she was able to reignite the conversations and the connections with past guests, which not only is great for podcast growth, but also allows you to make deeper connections with the people that you're connecting with on your show, right? So like it works on both levels. So that's one, like those are some numbers and some goals that you can do that with. If you're looking at podcast success specifically, if you're thinking, okay, I'm looking at these numbers and looking at the data is so important. I think a lot of people don't look at the numbers. But if you look at the numbers, give it a 3-month window before you actually look at them. And that is because podcast growth is exponential. And so the people who are becoming new listeners are going to binge listen to your backlog. That is just how podcasters are. They like to binge listen on long road trips or whatever they're doing. So they're going to listen to a few episodes at a time. And so as you get to those higher numbers, your downloads are going to increase. If you launch with 1 episode, you're not going to see a lot of downloads in that first week. It's just a fact. If you launch with 4, you're more likely to see success, and you won't have podcast listeners saying, where are the rest of the episodes? Because they will say that.
Yeah. What you're sharing is so helpful because not once have you said download number, which is so important, but you have to put it in context. So ultimately, in my mind, it's almost like Instagram followers.
Yep.
It's exciting when it's building, but if you're trying to build your business or you're trying to have more of an impact, you don't necessarily know how that translates just based on that number. So I would assume you go back to that original values. Have you stayed in alignment with them? 2, what were your goals? Was it to have an impact? Was it to get a message out there and have a voice? Was it to generate leads and have more clients? And so those are all things you need to be thinking about. For me, and I truly mean this, there was one person that listened, that found me through this podcast, that wouldn't have encountered me otherwise, that had a solid takeaway from an episode. That's enough for me. Now, in all reality, for me to continue with the momentum and keep it going and keep it fresh, and, you know, there has to be a little bit more to it. But at the outset, that was where my mind was. And it sounds like for you, celebrating the wins, it's that snowball effect of the statistic that you gave in the beginning is so important for people to be mindful of. There are so many podcasts out there that are inactive or did not get past a certain point. There wasn't consistency. There wasn't that follow through. It wasn't ultimately successful in the ways that we're discussing. So significant numbers of episodes is really important. Level of impact is really important. And is it doing what you had intended at the outset?
Yeah.
Does that sound like
absolutely.
an accurate summary?
Thank you.
I love it.
And I'm just like, all these things.
I think that's the therapist in me, is that I had to get really good at like succinctly bringing it all full circle. But I also think that we as a society, especially in this day and age and with technology, instant gratification, we want to see immediacy, and it's not always going to work that way. But we need to see enough to sustain us. Can you speak on that at all? So for someone who has already started their podcast and might be questioning, is this worth my while? What are those things that are going to keep them going and that they should be thinking about?
So podcasting is a marathon. It is not a sprint. It is not It is something that you really have to put in time and effort, and that's why people come to me, because they're like, I don't have capacity to do all this stuff. I just want to show up, record, and you handle the rest. Cool, we got you. But when it comes to you've got some downloads under your belt, you've got your podcast, but you're not seeing that growth, and you want that instant gratification, right? So we're kind of marrying the two ideas here a little bit. One of the quickest ways to grow your podcast is to be a guest on other people's podcasts. Now, notice I didn't say stop your podcast and be a guest on other people's podcasts. You have to be doing both at the same time. And so what that does is podcasters listen to lots of podcasts. I believe the number is 9 now every week that podcasters listen to at a time. So, yeah. So, and just because they're listening to my podcast about podcasting doesn't mean that they're not listening to other podcasts about podcasting, right? So this is why I love the author analogy, because just because you read, we're going to go with alien romance, just because you read one author who writes alien romance doesn't mean that you're not going to read the other person because you only read this person. Same with podcasters. So being on not just people in your industry or comparable ones, or ones that are like, oh, well, they do something that is interesting to my audience too. That's cool. But also different ones. So one of the examples that I give people is like, if you are a dog person and you have dogs, go be on a dog podcast, right? Like, I'm sure there are maybe 5 people in that audience who are interested in what you're talking about outside of being a dog parent. And they might be interested. And it's not only have you made a connection with this new person, which is part of being a guest on other people's shows, creating that connection and that reciprocity, right, of podcaster to podcaster, because we know how hard it is to do this job. We know how much effort goes into these, like, putting together these shows. But it allows people to see that you're a multifaceted human being, that you are not just the person that talks about this one thing, because then that gets redundant, and you're going to, the listeners will see, oh, they were on that show and I already heard what they said about that. I don't need to listen to that. But if you're on something different, then you're connecting with different people that might not be in those same circles. So broadening a little bit on the shows that you're on. But that is one of the quickest ways to grow your show. We saw one client do that where she connected with someone who was a potential almost competitor to her, where, like I said, she was doing a smaller group of these people who needed help with boundaries, and this person was doing a broader group of, like, adult children, right? And so she was a guest on that show, tripled her downloads. Then a year later, she was on another show that was even bigger than that one, tripled her downloads, and got 6 clients from it. So, like, we've seen this work, and it's one of the quickest ways to see, did that guest spot work well? And here's why. But also know that most podcasters are looking out a few weeks, right, in when your episode's going to go live. So you have to be diligent in consistently showing up for that.
Yes. That's amazing. What great nuggets of wisdom. I'm also thinking too, how when you are a guest on someone's show, I know when I listen to podcasts and I am impressed, someone has intrigued me, their personality, or they're doing something incredible, I find myself finding everything I can out about them, right? I may be much more likely to follow them, check out their website, do they have their own show, etc. And so, yeah, the momentum just builds. And I think your point around, yes, sharing audiences with people who could be potential clients or who are in alignment, no brainer. But I love that. Broaden the horizons. Stay multifaceted, keep it dynamic, because you don't want to be on multiple podcasts talking about the exact same things. We are evolving beings, and we can, like you said, just like we're putting our own spin on something, even if it's been talked about before, stepping outside the box can be a beautiful thing, and you're just opening more doors. So that's a great tip. Do you have any other final thoughts that you think are really imperative that we can leave the audience with before we share how they can follow you and get in touch with you?
If you're feeling overwhelmed, take a deep breath. Is the first thing. Because this is a lot, right? Like I said, we've been doing this for a while. We've launched a ridiculous amount of podcasts and produced a ridiculous amount of episodes. And it is possible to do without a team. It really is. You just have to be clear on your values, right? So if your values are to have a high quality show that is, you know, very well produced, then you might need to invest in that. You might not have time. Or if you're like, look, I'm going to show up messy because that's how I show up on my lives, or that's how I show up in my life, and this is what it is, then you're going to attract the people that you want to attract with that. For example, I was on a show where the woman's child was running around in the background and like making noises. That is not a show that I personally will listen to, because I hear my kids enough. I don't need to hear your kids too. But her people were attracted to that, right? So like being clear on that, I think will help you in deciding, all right, how much effort and time do I need to put into this? And that's going to be important to help you decide on if a podcast is going to be the right direction for you.
For sure. Incredible words of wisdom. Thank you so much for all you shared. So grateful for the work that you do. How can people find you, work with you, follow you? And we'll make sure to include in the show notes.
Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate being on here. I love talking podcasting. So you can find me on Instagram at alesia.galati or at galatimedia.com. Either of those places are the best places to find me.
Awesome. Well, keep up the great work. You pioneer you. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review. This will help others find us and benefit as well. The Compassionate Climb podcast represents the opinions of Julia Napini and her guests. The information provided is intended for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice. If that is what you are seeking, please consult an attorney.